Hey everyone, and welcome to the tutorial series for the NPC Manager system. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the optimization settings that we can adjust to make sure that we squeeze as much performance as possible from our NPCs. And we actually have three different systems that come with the NPC Manager. A basic proximity system, we have some visibility options, and we have some rendering options. And let's go ahead and jump into Unreal, and we're going to keep talking as we use these systems. And we are right where we left off. Last time we were playing around with the NPCs and looking at their dialogue and player interaction. So now all I did before the video is I resized the bounding box here to a more regular size. And if I go to the profile, we still have the standard task, roam within bounds, and they're going to be roaming for 5 minutes, 300 seconds. And if we click play here, the NPC will simply roam around for 300 seconds. And right now you can see that the NPC is doing everything as expected. It's animating, has an idle animation, it goes around, it's doing pretty much everything as normal. But what if we have an NPC that is really far away in the scene that we can't even see because maybe they're cold, maybe there's a massive building or a mountain? Typically, we would not want that NPC to be active unless we can actually see it. And this is when the proximity system comes into play. The idea is that each NPC will stay in one of three different stages at all times. They will be fully active, which is what we have right now without using anything. Everything is active, everything is ticking, all the systems, all the animations. Then they can be partially active when certain parts of the NPCs are turned off. For example, animations are turned off, tick is turned off. There's some optimizations that are done, but they're still moving and interacting. And then they can be fully inactive, and they're basically called out completely. Their routines are stopped, they become invisible. Their player controllers are stopped, everything. And that is again to save on performance. And the idea came from a GDC talk that I saw on Assassin's Creed, I believe it was Unity, I believe, where basically they have two different rings around the player. They had an inner ring, which means that any NPC within that inner ring will be fully active, and then they had an outer ring. And any NPCs between the inner and outer ring will be partially active, and anything outside of the outer ring will be fully inactive. That way we can have a bunch of NPCs, hundreds of NPCs in the scene, and we will only see the NPCs that we need to see. So the first thing we'll do is we'll make sure that the proximity system is turned on for the NPC, and that is on by default, by the way, but let me just go ahead and verify. Click on your NPC, click on the controller, and go down to optimization settings. And you can see here that we have use proximity settings as ticked. There's also a bunch of inactive options, so you can further customize what it means for the NPC to be fully inactive. And you can see that by default, they're all ticked except pause routine. So make invisible, disable collision, stop tick, stop animation, disable components, disable AI controller. By default, I am not pausing the routine, and the reason for that is because if you're doing something like a day-night cycle and the NPC is really far away, you don't want the NPC to resume its routine when you finally get to him, because a lot of time could have passed and the NPC would be desynced with the time. So you can still do it depending on the type of game, but by default is off. Okay, so the only thing we need to do is make sure that the NPC itself has this enabled, and then we go and select our NPC Manager blueprint. And you guys remember a few videos ago, I told you that every single scene must have one of these guys present in your level. And you just dropped it in, and you don't have to really do anything. The NPC will find it and use it to its advantage. Here, this is going to be a central hub for the NPCs to figure out whether they need to be active or inactive based on the player position. This also does that. So all you need to do is click on the NPC manager and go scroll down all the way to setup proximity and tick use player proximity. Then you see that there are some settings here. How frequently are we going to check the player proximity? By default, every 2 seconds. And then we have two numbers here that are fairly large. Full activation radius is 5,000 units. In other words, any NPCs within 5,000 units of any player will be fully active, and then the partial activation would be 8,000 units. In other words, if an NPC is within 5,000 units, it'll be fully active. If it's between 5,001 and 8,000, it'll be partially active, and any NPC farther away than 8,000 units will be fully inactive. Because we have a small level, let's go ahead and make this smaller. We'll make this 1,000 and 2,000. Or let's make this 3,000. We also want to show, and this is for debug purposes, the player trace, and we want to show the activation stats. And these two are purely so we can visualize what's happening here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and press save, and now we have our NPC here, and if we press play here, we're going to actually, let's disable the debug routine so we can see the numbers better. So select the NPC, controller, debug options, debug routine, deselected, and now press play. And notice, and I'm going to make this bigger, notice that we have now, I'm going to zoom out here, we have two different spheres, one which is green and one which is orange. The green one is the inner circle, and the orange one is the outer circle. Notice that the NPC is in between those two traces, and it is partially active. And you know it's partially active because you can see that the NPC is still walking, but it's not animating. See, so we disabled the animation, we disabled the skeletal mesh, but the NPC is still walking. So obviously right now it looks silly, but in a real case scenario, this circle will be really big. So you would see this NPC really far in the distance, really tiny on the screen, and you could see that that it's moving, but you're not going to notice that it's not really animating. Notice also on the left-hand side that we have a list of active, partial, and inactive NPCs that gives you general stats for the entire scene. So what happens is if I move closer to our NPC, notice that he becomes active and now he is fully animating. And now I move back. And remember, we're updating this every 2 seconds. And now he becomes partially active. And if I go all the way here, notice that he now disappears. He's still there, but he's fully inactive. He's invisible. He has no collision. He basically, for all intents and purposes, is as light as I can make him without pausing the routine, and he doesn't exist. And as soon as I get close enough, the NPC becomes first partially active, and then fully active, as you can see here. And that is the general idea. So if you have a bunch of NPCs in your world, the ones that are far away will be automatically made inactive, and then you'll have an inner circle of partials, and then your closest circle as active. That is pretty much it. If you just activate that and you understand what's going on, that should give you a significant boost in performance in your level. Again, assuming that you have a bunch of NPCs. Now, you may want certain NPCs to not follow that for whatever reason. Maybe there's a hero NPC, or maybe there's a giant NPC that you can see really from far away, right? Maybe a giant like, I forget what the name is, Shadow of the Colossus is that game. And in that case, he could physically be very far away, but because he's so big, you don't want him to go partially active or inactive. In that case, for that specific NPC, go ahead and disable it, and he will always be simulating at full capacity. On the same token, if you have really smaller NPCs, you can adjust the setting there as well. Now there's another one, which is the visibility, which again is on by default here. If we go to the options, and visibility is basically, we are tracing from the player itself to see if we can actually see the NPC. And again, think about this scenario. In a real game, I'm going to hit play so we can visualize it here. In a real game, these circles are obviously going to be much bigger. So there could be a scenario where you are in the middle of town and there's a bunch of buildings or houses, and you may have 50 NPCs that are active because they're all going to be within your circle. However, there are some NPCs that are inside a house, which you cannot see. Maybe inside this POI, and there's real walls and you can't see. So wouldn't it be great if we could make those NPCs that we can't physically see partially active? That would save even further on performance. They will still be moving, but they won't be animating. And then once you open the door and you go inside and you can actually see them, then they would automatically become fully animated. And that is the idea of the visibility system. You should use it on top of the proximity system to further call out all of the NPCs that are nearby. And the way I'm going to do this is very simple. We're going to create a little wall. So drag a little cube here. And we're just going to scale this guy like this and like this. In other words, we want to make sure that we cannot see the NPC. Actually, let's scale it like this so it's easier for us to see if we can see the NPC or not. And we are going to test, even though we are very close to the NPC, which is going to make the NPC active, if we cannot see the NPC, then they should go partial as well. So that's what we're going to do. So to do this, we are going to actually open the player character. And notice that by default, we have a component called Player NPC Check. And this component is the one that will actually do the line traces for nearby NPCs. And by default, this is inactive, so it's not working. So you have to come here and manually activate it. And when you activate it, there's a few options here. Use proximity system. I highly recommend that you say yes. This is best used with the proximity system. It does less searching for the NPCs. You don't have to trace as much. But if for some reason you're not using proximity system and you just want to use this one, deselect it here. Trace frequency, we're going to be tracing for NPCs, in this case every half a second. The radius is 8,000. The trace offset is going to be 80. In other words, I'm moving the trace up closer to where the head of the NPC would be. So it's not in the center. And then you can debug the traces or debug the area trace. This will only work, the area trace, if you are not using the proximity system. So what we'll do here is we are going to debug the visibility traces so we can actually see what the traces look like. And now we are going to press play. Actually, let's do something, sorry. Let's make the circles a little bit bigger. So on the NPC manager, go to proximity system, and let's make the full activation 2000. And you can leave the partial at 3000. And the reason for that is it's going to make it easier for us to do this. Click play. And you can see that the NPC is fully active. Look at the green circle. And you can also see the traces. I'm going to eject. You can see the traces coming from the player camera. We don't want the trace to come from the player's character, but from the camera. Now watch what happens if I move my player camera here and I eject. Look at Henry. It's automatically partially active, even though we're still inside the green circle, which means that the proximity system will say, hey, this guy's active. Our visibility trace, as you can see here, is basically saying, nope, he's actually inactive. And that is further optimization. If you have a game that has a lot of buildings or caves or mountains or anything that would occlude NPCs, this is going to make a big difference. And of course, if I possess, as soon as I can see the NPC, notice that he becomes active again. Remember, we're doing this every half a second. So because of the frequency, you may have a slight second when you can see there that he becomes, you can see the transition there, but the reason is because it's half a second. So if you're seeing that this is not enough, you can change the frequency to like 0.1 second, 0.2 seconds, make it more frequent, and then you can remedy that issue there, right? So that's the idea, guys. And the last one is rendering. And that is very similar to visibility. I would actually not recommend using both. I think it's overkill using 3. I would say either use proximity and visibility or proximity and rendering. And actually, a quick note here, the visibility system is only right now usable in single player. So if you're doing a single player game, you can use this system. If you're doing a multiplayer game, this will not work with multiplayer. You need to use visibility, which is a different thing, which is basically checking when that NPC was last rendered for the local client and then making them partially disabled that way. Okay. So if we disable visibility and we enable rendering, rendering optimization, you see that we have the exact same options here as we had before. You can tweak these options here, including pause routine. By the way, pause routine for both visibility and rendering will only work in single player mode. If you have a multiplayer game and you check pause routine, this will be automatically disregarded. Again, you don't want one player affecting the NPC for the entire game when the NPC should be active, because again, it's a multiplayer game. So there's some additional intelligence in the code to make sure that you don't kind of mess up accidentally there. So let's go back to our player component. We are going to disable the component because we're not going to be using visibility. And one final thing, if we go to the NPC manager, you actually have an option here under setup to show render stats. And this is to show, it'll basically show you which NPCs are rendered and which NPCs are not. Again, because you won't be able to visualize it by doing exactly what I did before, because as soon as you eject and look at them, the NPC is rendered. So then, of course, it'll seem like it's always active, but it's not. So if I click play here, you see that NPC rendered 1, and it is active. Notice that there's a separate section there. And notice now that if I look away, the NPC now appears as not rendered. And if I look, the NPC is rendered. And now the NPC is not rendered. So again, it's a different system using the is rendered node, I believe it's called. I personally prefer the visibility system. I actually found that in some cases it's actually slightly more performant, believe it or not, to be doing those traces. You would think not, but actually polling Unreal to see when an actor was last rendered is actually quite expensive. Obviously not as expensive as actually simulating the NPC animating, but you know, there is a cost there. So that is pretty much it. With the rendering, all you need to do is turn that on and you don't have to worry about it. And this is the combination that I would suggest if you're doing a multiplayer game. And that is pretty much it, guys. They're on by default on the NPC, but not on the blueprints here. So make sure that if you want to use those systems, you specifically enable the systems here. Otherwise, your NPCs will be active all the time. And that is the default behavior. I want you to make a conscious decision that you're making the NPCs inactive. And it doesn't appear like this was a mistake or it was broken. I want to make sure that you understand that you are using this system and you configure it to your game. So that is pretty much it, guys. We looked at the proximity system, we looked at the visibility system, and we looked at the rendering system. Proximity works for both single and multiplayer. Visibility works for single player, and rendering works for single player and multiplayer. All right, guys, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me here or DM me via Discord or join the community. We have a pretty active community. Show us what you're working on and let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you guys so much, and I'll talk to you in the next video.